Well, again, thank you, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to share a little preamble, some thoughts before I get into my presentation. My plan, this is sort of an introductory talk about the course that we're going to be offering starting next Saturday, Jung and Alchemy, or Jung on Alchemy. And my plan for the course is to make alchemy less mysterious and less impenetrable than it usually is. We've taught a couple of courses here strictly on Jung, classical Jungian psychology, Jung 101 and Jung 102. And in response to a lot of requests from the people in Jung 102, we had one module on alchemy, and everybody said there's just so much and we didn't really get to cover everything. So could we have a course on alchemy? So I love alchemy and love Jung, so I said, sure, let's do that. So I was going to do actually Intro to Depth Psychology this fall, but because of the requests, we chose alchemy. And alchemy can be very dense and very mysterious and very impenetrable. And he said that symbols are the language of the unconscious, and alchemy is a rich source of dynamic symbolism. However, alchemy is so rich in symbolism that it's easy to become lost in a sea of symbols. But what I want to do is approach the topic from several different perspectives or different angles. My hope is that we'll gradually see the meaning and practical value of these symbols emerge from this sort of hazy alchemical soup. Maybe it's a stew of symbols. It's just very thick, radiant, numinous symbols. And what happens is not only do we get perhaps confused by the multiplicity and different layers of different types of mythologies that emerge from alchemy, but they also constellate things in us. I found that whenever teaching a Jung class, the material itself seems to constellate whatever's in our own unconscious. We begin to do our own inner work. And for that reason, it's really important to keep things sort of sectioned off and make as much differentiation as we can so that we don't get overwhelmed by it and can really get at the meat without being kind of washed away. Jung had said that if you're going to go out fishing in the ocean, you need to have a realistic sense of the size of your boat. If your boat is too small, the fish that you haul in may sink your boat. Of course, he's talking about the ocean of the unconscious, and the boat is the ego and the rational mind. If you're doing inner work and you're bringing out things that are too big, if you try to get Moby Dick into your little boat, it sinks the boat, and you either just go unconscious or the worst case scenario is psychosis and all that. But the idea is that we want to have a strong boat and not be overwhelmed by the symbols. So alchemy can be like that. It can easily wash us overboard in a flood of the symbols. And we can lose track of whether we're talking about chemistry, or are we talking about religion, or are we talking about mythology or psychology. All these symbols become constellated, and things get activated. The symbols are not static. As soon as we start to work with the symbols, they activate things within us. So Jung went through extraordinarily painstaking labors for over 25 years of his life, mining these symbols and going through these same things I'm describing, and differentiating and trying to work out their meanings, both the sort of the plain sense, practical meaning, the symbolic meaning, and particularly, he wanted to know what the meaning would be for application to his process, for his patients. His goal always was to try to help people to heal. So the reason it's difficult to dig through that is the symbolism, and because not just that, but alchemy as an art, not yet a science. Alchemy didn't really become a science. When it becomes a science, it's chemistry. It's no longer alchemy. At least it's not science as we understand it today. But alchemy as an art lies at one of the great crossroads of human development, and that's one of the main underlying themes that I want to underscore throughout this whole course. Now, another reason that alchemy is difficult to understand is because different people approach alchemy from different angles and with different agendas. If you follow alchemy through the history of science, a historian of science wants to wipe away all the myth and religious mumbo jumbo, as they would call it, and show that alchemists were really early scientists. They want to try to show that alchemists did have a system, that they were trying to develop the early beginnings of science. Historians of religion, on the other hand, want to show the vast sea of esotericism of the pre-modern era. They want to draw out some of the myths, show the roots of those myths and the religious significance of them and the germinal beginnings of science, how the myths attach themselves to that. They want to show the religious and mythological influences that emerge in alchemical texts. And in addition to all these, there's a whole other group of people who have chosen alchemy to be their own spiritual path, their personal path, and they treat their alchemical work as a spiritual practice. So we have all these different people with a different agenda, different purpose, and that again adds to the confusion of where, if you pick just a random website or a random book about alchemy, you don't know where in this group of different people and different agendas you're going to land, unless you're very careful about what you're choosing. So after all these, then there's Jungian psychology, which takes an entirely different tack. Jung saw in alchemical symbolism a process that perfectly mirrored his discovery of the individuation process. As we've said, Jung said that symbols are the language of the unconscious, and in alchemy, Jung found a rich source of symbolism that helped him in his work. So in order to thread a path through all of this data, I want to try to begin with a broad view of what each of these many projects actually was in terms of this broad sweep of human development that I was talking about earlier. So, and to that end, what I'm going to do is share my screen and pull up some PowerPoints and get to work on that. If I can find, okay, here we go.
James, if I can just intervene here for a moment while you're doing that and just let everybody know, if you do have questions or comments, please feel free to just type them into the chat. Most of you are probably familiar with that by now, but you can move your mouse on the screen or whatever device you're using, and you should see that chat button pop up at the bottom. It might be on the side if you're on an iPhone, I'm not sure. But you can do that by just moving your mouse typically, and you'll find it there, and just type in whatever you'd like. And then James will typically, I guess I should let you speak to that, James, but typically you'll try to address some or most of those questions and comments by the time we get toward the end.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to do when I have the PowerPoint up, and that's why I appreciate Jeremy being here usually, and now I appreciate you, Bonnie, because
no problem. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so any questions, and of course you can always unmute and do that, but it's up to you how you want to ask a question. And there will be, or hope, depending on how much time I take going through all this material, there should be plenty of time for questions when we finish. So this is the introduction to the 8-week course. We hope that the course will be something that clarifies things for people. I'm going to give a little base and background of how I see Jung and Jung's work and the different perspectives. And then I'm going to go through sort of a review of each of the different modules that we'll be covering in the subsequent eight weeks of this course. So again, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to start by saying something about the unique place in human history that alchemy occupies. Now, we could say that humanity spent millions of years transitioning from instinct to reason. At the time that alchemy appeared in Europe, Western European culture was just at the lip of what has come to be thought of as the height of human reason, the so-called Enlightenment period, or what some call the early modern period. However, not long after this great achievement of the Enlightenment, it became clear that something was wrong. And it was Jung who recognized that reason could not function effectively if we are removed from the roots of our being. The unconscious intrudes itself and creates problems. If we try to be, as they say, pure reason, unless we include the unconscious, we're going to have a very difficult time. So he ushered in another transition, and I like to think of this transition as being from reason to intuition. Now that's a little confusing because of the way Jung uses intuition in his psychological types, but if you'll bear with me, I just like to use it that way. We can also think of some other ways, and I'll suggest some other ways to think of it. But when we move from reason to intuition, we're not abandoning reason. We simply listen respectfully to the roots of our beings, to our intuition, and to the collective unconscious. This should be familiar to anyone who's familiar with Jungian psychology. And I should mention also that If you're not familiar with Jungian psychology, we will have opportunity to address specifics. I know a lot of people who are in Jung 101 and Jung 102 will be familiar with a lot of the things I'm going to talk about. Some of you may not, but there will be an ample opportunity to ask questions about that and to clarify that. It's with Jung, he's really not that complicated. A lot of what he had to say has already entered into the culture and people are familiar with it. But there's a lot of it, and little by little, if we clarify it, I think it'll become clear. So now Jung referred to this original cultural shift that I mentioned, or this transition, in various ways. I'm calling it moving from instinct to reason. Jung might have said something like moving from eros to logos, or from feminine to masculine, from the mythic to the rational, etc. There's a lot of different ways to think of it, but there's this movement, dynamic movement of humanity towards this, what many people thought the Enlightenment was, everything was going to be, we're going to be able to achieve everything now. That's what they call positivism. There's a sense that modern science is going to really solve all the problems of the world. Now, the project of modern science has been to perfect reason. It's this moving from instinct to reason. And the project has been to perfect reason. The highest goals of science have been to perfect reason for the service of human life. Jung, however, has already begun the work of moving from what I'm calling reason to intuition. We could call it reconnecting with the instincts, listening to the unconscious, or whatever we like. The point is that this is an inevitable cultural shift that must happen, however much we and others in the culture may resist it. It is happening, and we are always on firmer ground when we make this shift. It's not that we reject reason, but we now integrate reason with the depths of our being and the unconscious, and we have a dialogue there. So Jung was determined to be scientific himself, but because of his knowledge of the psyche, his own idea of perfecting reason meant reconnecting with the roots of our being, with the eros, with the feminine, and with the world of myth, not by abandoning reason, but by using our instinctual nature to inform our rational functions, by creating a dialogue with the unconscious. Now, he found essentially in alchemy all of the Western cultural elements that 2,000 years of Christian culture had repressed. Pagan myth, the fascination with matter, fascination with the body, the feminine, and a host of symbolic images that laid out a path for muting these apparently, or so-called lower elements into something higher by merging them with the so-called higher elements. And I say so-called because to the people of that age, the feminine and the body and the earth and instincts were all lower, and this patriarchal vision of pure reason and pure sort of, in some senses, dissociation from these other things was meant to be higher. But the idea now in Jung's work is to integrate the two. So how do the alchemists fit in this, and what exactly were the alchemists doing? Well, alchemy is a hybrid of Greek philosophy, Egyptian dyeing, that means dyeing of cloths, and there's a lot of different technical working with matter that Egyptians did, including mummification and other material matter-oriented techniques, and add on to that ancient metallurgy. It's sort of an amalgam of all of these put together, and they evolved over centuries. Now, the dictionary of Gnosis and Western esotericism describes the basic process in this way. Alchemy endeavors to produce noble metals, which means gold or silver, preferably gold, precious stones, the panacea or elixir of life. And the elixir of life early on was really more a Chinese alchemy goal. It wasn't so much in European alchemy, but it did enter in later when pharmaceuticals became more integrated with it. But so it's endeavoring to produce metals, precious stones, the panacea, or the elixir of life, and above all, the philosopher's stone. On the one hand, alchemy seeks to do this by finding the right mixture of natural substances according to the ancient doctrine of the elements, which is earth, air, fire, and water, cold and wet, moist and dry, all these things. The elements and the qualities. First of all, an unknown substance must be reduced to the prima materia. So the alchemists were always looking for this unknown substance so that they could then break it down. There's an Aristotelian idea that goes back to the early Greek philosophers that there's a prime basic matter that makes up everything in the universe. And if we can break things down to that matter, the theory of the alchemists goes, then we would be able to build it back up by changing these different elements: earth, air, fire, water, wet, cold, dry, moist. Changing all these things in a particular way, we would be able to then create the great work, the opus magnum, and transmute actually metal, say lead, into gold. Now this seemed like a practical based on philosophy. Now the philosophers didn't deal with matter at all. They were just completely abstract in their heads. The Egyptians, on the other hand, dealt only in matter and didn't really have they had more or less religious ideas about the afterlife and all that, but they did not have the kind of philosophical basis that the Greeks had. And when Alexander moved through Egypt and the Middle East, he brought all these Greek ideas which got mixed in with the Egyptian work with matter. So this transformation of matter happens in the great work, which passes through various stages. According to the colors that appear, these are called the negredo, or the black, the albedo, or the white, the citrinitas, which is the yellow, rubedo, which is red, among others. And each of these has psychological significance, which we can get into in the course. This change of coloration may be observed when an amalgam of copper and mercury is heated. According to the amount of evaporating mercury, white, yellow, red, and with further heat, gray and black colors are seen, and they're described by the alchemists as the peacock's tail. So that's a basic outline of the sort of practical basis of what the alchemists at least thought they were doing. Now, in order to understand the psychological importance of this, we need to understand the idea of psychological projection. Jung used the term participation mystique, or mystical participation, which is an anthropological term, which describes animism in ancient, not ancient, but what we used to call primitive tribes. There's a sense of being one with their environment, and the tree has a soul, and the river has a soul. The idea in modern people is that this is a human tendency to project unconscious contents into the environment. And this is a diagram from Esther Harding's book, The I and the Not I. And it's a child, but it's the same in adults. The idea is that when we encounter anything unknown, anything new, there's a certain level of anxiety occurs in the unconscious, and the unconscious searches around for something parallel, something similar. And as it reaches for that, when it sees something that looks similar, it throws that up and says, oh, it's this. And that's projected and experienced not as in the unconscious, but as being in either the person or the thing or the situation outside of oneself. And that's a kind of a Reader's Digest condensed definition of projection. But this is going on with the alchemists. Here's Jung's description of the experience of the alchemists when they were still in a state of participation mystique, that is, identification with the object of their study. So Jung says, this was a time when the mind of the alchemist was still grappling with the problems of matter, when the exploring consciousness was confronted by the dark void of the unknown, in which figures and laws were dimly perceived and attributed to matter, although they really belonged to the psyche of the alchemist. He was projecting these ideas and attributes into what he was studying. Everything unknown and empty is filled with psychological projection. It is as if the investigator's own psychic background were mirrored in the darkness. What he sees in matter, or thinks he can see, is chiefly the data of his own unconscious, which he is projecting into it. In other words, he encounters in matter, as apparently belonging to it, certain qualities and potential meanings of whose psychic nature he is entirely unconscious. Now, drawing on his theory of the collective unconscious, Jung felt that the descriptions of the transformation of metals in the alchemist's flask found in these ancient alchemical texts He found these descriptions in the alchemical texts, and they mirrored the archetypal patterns experienced by individuals who are moving through what Jung called the individuation process. He observed this in himself and in others, and he was searching for, he thought if this was real, if it had an archetypal basis, it would have occurred somewhere in history. First, he looked at the Gnostics, and he thought, well, it must be there, but they were too vague and imprecise. But even though at first alchemy looked just completely nonsensical, he began to intuit that at first when he read Richard Wilhelm's Secret of the Golden Flower, which is a Taoist alchemical text. When he started reading that, that's when he realized, oh my goodness, this is where it is. So Jung felt that these dynamic depictions of the subjective transformation process occurring in individuals not only provided confirmation and validation of his own theories, but he found that they provided a rich lexicon for understanding the dreams of his patients and a host of cultural phenomena. Individuation is Jung's name for the process of moving from reason to intuition, or as I'm calling it, or if you prefer, reconnecting with the instincts, listening to the unconscious, entering into the mythic world, etc. Now, this is Edward Edinger's diagram of the ego moving out of identification with the self, from instinct to reason, as I'm calling it. The connecting link, the ego-self axis, represents what I'm calling the movement from reason to intuition, or reconnecting with the instincts, listening to the unconscious, etc. Now, this is this one on the left, figure 1. The ego is completely encased in the self. And then we can see this now on both a cultural, this has to occur on both a cultural and an individual level. And so we can say at the time of the alchemist, some alchemists may have been the ego completely encased in the self, like figure 1. Some may have been just a little bit of differentiation between the ego and the self. Others a little bit more. And Jung felt that some of these alchemists, especially the later ones, seemed to not only have a complete differentiation from the ego and the self, but they also had developed this ego-self axis, this sense that they were aware that they were communicating with their own deep unconscious. But this is also part of the individual process that we each must go through to differentiate from the self and to develop a strong ego so that we can maintain these sometimes grandiose energies that come off of the collective unconscious, come off the archetypes, and maintain that connection with the archetypal realm through this ego-self axis. And although we're differentiated, we know the difference, we can apply our rational thinking mind to the products of the unconscious without being overwhelmed by them, without kowtowing to them, but also without ignoring them and treating them as if they're meaningless. So this parallels the alchemist. As the alchemist moves out of participation mystique with the chemical substance, he moves into the role of the objective chemist or the scientist. So as culture progressed, this differentiation happened, and eventually this was the desacralization of alchemy. There's nothing sacred anymore about alchemy. It was just an objective science, and it became what we now refer to as modern chemistry. There's many of the elements of modern chemistry were still being used and systematized in alchemy, but there was no differentiation between the mythic world and the objective, rational, scientific world. Now in modern chemistry, they would kick someone out of the, if they have an academy of chemists, they would kick them out very soon if they started spouting some of the things that the alchemists did when they looked into their flasks. So alchemy was a forgotten relic of history at the time that Jung first took an interest into it. It was an embarrassment to science. It was a massive confusion for the mythologist, and it was a playground for the esoterically inclined. If nothing else, we can certainly say that alchemy is a remarkable example of mythic symbolism and mythic thinking. Up to the present time, alchemy has primarily been studied in 3 different ways: through the history of science, through the history of religions, and or you could say through the history of mythology, and recently, thanks to Jung, through psychology. Since Jung first took an interest in alchemy in the mid-1920s, many people, including historians of science, have taken a fresh look at alchemy, and there's been a renewed interest in it around the world. And a lot of these people, particularly historians of science, would completely deny that Jung had anything to do with it. But it's very clear that since Jung's interest and since his very clear exposition of how the unconscious was working in alchemy, this has spurred not only history of religions, it directly influenced Eliade, because Jung was in conferences with Eliade, Mircea Eliade, the historian of religion, and it sort of peripherally, even Homeyard, this author who was a historian of science, didn't publish until the late 50s, and he's one of the, before him, nobody in science published anything about alchemy. And he clearly was influenced by Jung, because there's nobody even publishing anything about alchemy until then. So it's remarkable the influence he's had. So in this course, what we want to do is approach the topic from each of these different perspectives. And by doing so, my hope is that the meaning and practical value of these symbols will gradually emerge, as I've said, from the hazy alchemical soup of symbols. So what I want to do now is go through the different modules and what we're going to do in the course, but I want to first check in with Bonnie and see if there's any questions have come up.
Thanks, James. This is so helpful to get this overview. We do have a question that was relating back to the ego self-axis that you showed there.
Yes.
Jacqueline's asking, some say that the ego is not encased in an impenetrable wall, but rather a permeable window. What's your take on that?
Oh, sure, definitely. No, it's not. No, the thing is, that's part of the evolutionary task. If a person is completely identified with this positivistic worldview, one necessarily wants to, if you remember, that there's a famous statement that Freud said to Jung, which he said, we need to make a bulwark against the black tide of occultism. And he meant, like, he didn't want the id to like flood into people by this interest that they were showing in the unconscious. And this is the attitude of people who try to construct an impermeable wall. And anyone who thinks there is an impermeable wall is fooling themselves, because when the energy encased in a person's complexes becomes greater than the energy of the ego to keep that so-called impermeable wall in place, that complex will break through every single time, whether you want it to or not. And that's what Joseph Campbell would call the call to adventure, because when your complexes break through, you are on a big adventure. And that's when you start to, you either try to rebuild that wall and pay no attention to that complex and hope it'll go away, or you begin to realize that there's something else going on, and the wall becomes, you consciously and deliberately work to get access to the unconscious. Now, there's also people who think that you should just leave that wall way open and just let it all come in. But that's very, very dangerous as well, because you can be easily, as I said earlier, if you don't have a strong ego, if you don't have a strong sense of keeping those things at bay, they can overwhelm your boat, and you get, what generally happens is that you go either from identification with the archetypes that emerge, or you keep that wall, you try to keep the wall permeable, and impermeable, and when you do that, you have no energy whatsoever. The energy comes from the symbols that arise from the archetypes, and if you don't allow yourself access to them, then you become completely alienated from those energies, and that's how people get depressed. They have flattened affect, they have no access to any of these things. So it's this moving back and forth between alienation and identification that is sort of almost the definition of when that alienation is when you keep the wall, you think you're keeping it impermeable between the ego and the self, or the unconscious. And identification is when it bursts through and grabs a hold of you. That's why you want to consciously direct your energies to receiving the messages from the unconscious with discrimination and with caution. Does that answer that question?
I think it answers it in a general way. However, there's a but coming from Jacqueline, which is a very well-deserved but, because as we both know, Jung often contradicted himself. And the but is, Jung said that the ego should be hard and small like a stone.
Sure. Yeah. How's that a but?
Well, I guess maybe you've already answered that within that question. So Jacqueline, if you want to say more about that, you can. I think the question is whether or not it should be impermeable at all, or small and hard, I guess being the.
Well, small and hard. Yeah, I mean, it should be small and hard. The ego has to be. First of all, if it's getting too big, then we call that inflation, or what I was just calling identification. But it's got to be hard, because it does have to. There has to be a defense against being overwhelmed by the unconscious. At the same, and that's where the hardness has to be. It also has to be small, so that it does not feel that it's somehow greater than or identified with the unconscious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that answers it for me too. And I think personally, again, I'll just say, it's symbolic. Jacqueline is saying now, because Estonia is impermeable. I think that was her meaning. I think you've covered that. That's fine. We do have another question. And I'm sorry, Jacqueline, if you want to say more about this, please do. I do want to get to the other question. And that is asking if you, James, intend to spend time teaching on psychological and psychotherapeutic utilization of the principles and practices of alchemy.
Yes. Now, what I won't be doing, what the course is not, is it's not going to, people sometimes want to have a dream book where you open it up and, oh, I dreamed of a cat, and so that means I'm going to meet a tall, dark stranger or something like that. I'm not going to, I don't think that's a useful way to understand alchemy. One of the reasons I want to, the images and the symbols of alchemy carry their own explanation and their own meaning with them. And if we approach them, the first half of the course, I want to approach them in first so you'll see in a second, history of science, history of religion, Jung's whole entire body of work, and then the sort of the cultural milieu in which that happens. The last 4 modules, I plan to go specifically into some notes here, specifically into the basics of the alchemical symbol, the basics of alchemy, as I mentioned them just a moment ago, but in much more detail, and with what Jung thought the psychological significance was. Then in module 6 would be dream interpretation, how the alchemical symbols are useful and work in dream interpretation, alchemical symbolism in individuation, and how dream symbolism works with the whole idea of the process of individuation, but specifically in relationship to what Jung talks about in Mysterium Conjunctionis. In alchemy, that's the separatio and the conjunctio process, the 2 elements of the process that particularly refer to that. That's related to individuation. And then the final module is again continuing the discussion that will go on in module 4, which is seeing things in a broad cultural level. And that's also important for working psychotherapeutically, because everybody is trying to adapt to this modern world that we're in. And we see all around us people who are in different relationships to these same symbols. Some people are denying them, some people are possessed by them, some people are trying to work with them, as we're trying to do here. And that's anybody. If you have a client, they're going to need to be negotiating these cultural barriers also. So that's how we'll be doing that. It's not going to be, it's not like a strictly a how-to thing. My goal with all of these courses, this is an 8-week course. You can't cover, Jung spent 25 years on alchemy. What I want to do is empower people, kind of hit the touchstones to, if there's a particular area that you are particularly important in interested in, then that area you'll find resources and you'll find ways to expand on that. And you'll have a wedge into that area, but we can't cover everything. And the main thing is to put a lot of information there that empowers you to then go on and do your own research in the direction that is most useful for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, James. Just a reminder to everybody, the early bird discount ends tonight. If you are interested in that 8-week course, so be sure you register today if you can in order to get that discount. We have one more question, James, to that end. It's kind of specific, so do you want to take it now or do you want to continue? I want to make sure we
Sure.
allow enough time, but this is one of those questions that I'm also interested in, so I suspect other people are as well.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to, wherever, yeah.
Wherever we go. Okay, good. All right, so this question is, does alchemy address the difference between indigenous cultures of reverence toward nature and the domination and control illusions of modern societies?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say alchemy is one of the elements of, alchemy is the sort of the early form of, what was the phrase you used to say modern culture?
Dominance and control illusions.
Yeah, illusions of dominance and control. So yeah, alchemy is an early kind of premature step into the direction of dominance control, but while still valuing the values of the indigenous cultures. That's why I was saying that it's at a crossroads of human history, because it's at this place. The denigration of indigenous peoples and the denigration of the feminine and of the earth and all that comes about as a part of this project of perfecting reason. The idea of from the position of perfecting reason, the primitive so-called and indigenous peoples are completely identified with instinct. They're in the instinct realm, and they have not yet gotten on board with the project of perfecting reason. So with modern culture, we're kind of stuck in this place where we think we perfected reason, and so we're trying to dominate all these people who we think haven't quite caught up with us. Whereas what Jung is saying is that they have what we're missing. Now we have things that they're missing. They don't have the discriminatory ability to make this I don't want to say all, that's why I don't like the word primitive, but in general, those cultures are still in one of these places where they're still identified with animism. This is where the whole word participation mystique came from, watching indigenous cultures be identified with the environment. Now that's something that we need and don't have, but they also, the primitive cultures, so-called, need the discrimination and the ability to help their families and the communities survive in the world in general, but particularly survive in protecting themselves from these people who think they are so superior. So the state of dominance is a state of, it's like this state where the pure reason is here, but there's no ego self access. There's a break there, so it's completely dissociated. And there's this inflation, the state of inflation, where I am dominant, I am the god, I can control all the environment, I control all the money, and you people just haven't gotten on board yet, so, you know, get out of the way or we're going to bulldoze your rainforest.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, James. Very interesting. I don't see more questions right now. Just a note to everybody, if you're having a hard time finding that chat or getting into it, it might be because James's screen is full screen on your computer. So you can always hit escape and get out of that, and then you might have better luck navigating if you need it.
And can you just affirm that the questioner was satisfied with that reply?
Yes, questioner, can you affirm that? Just give us a type in there if you need to. And then we have an added comment on that note from Anne. She says that dominance allows Western people to treat other than human as objects and not subjects. And of course that's...
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a typical phenomena of inflation that happens on all levels. You know, it happens politically, it happens socially, it happens culturally, and that's part of the identification. But it's also, and it will work as long as the person has enough money or enough admirers to allow them to sustain it. But sooner or later, they encounter reality and they have a rude awakening.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, you know, for us, the rude awakening may be the atom bomb. We don't know. We hope.
Let's hope not.
Hope
Yeah.
we can...
Yeah. Anne calls it cultural narcissism. That's a good term.
Absolutely. That's a very good term. Yeah.
Yeah. Craig, who's the person who had asked that original question, is he's saying in process. So I'm not sure if he's just processing what you're saying or if he's still typing something. So let's leave that for a moment. And then
Sure.
I do have another comment or question from Victoria, and she's asking or saying, I've always wondered if Jung believed that creation of literal alchemical gold or the stone elixir was a figment of imagination, or question mark, I know he studied Chinese alchemy, etc.
Yeah, well, I don't think that Jung ever thought that that was possible. I mean, yeah, it certainly is plain from modern day. There's a wonderful, at least partly wonderful, historian of science named Lawrence Principe, and he says that, I mean, there actually are ways that you can't transmute. It's pretty much been proven scientifically, at least from what we have now, that you cannot transmute elements into other elements. So that can't happen scientifically speaking. And I think Jung, to whatever degree people knew that at that time, he knew that as well. There are ways to sort of produce gold out of things just because there's minute amounts of gold in ocean water and in different stones and things like that, but it's not cost effective to do it. So people who have done that, they claim to have made gold, but they've actually extracted one element from another element, but it's very costly and not really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was the name? Lawrence what?
Lawrence Principe. Hold on a sec.
Principe. Principi.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And he's got a book which we will draw from in the first module, The Secrets of Alchemy. And it's an excellent book, but Principe, as I'll mention in a few minutes, like historians of science, completely, without ever bothering to actually learn what Jung was saying, completely dismisses Jung and misrepresents him because he didn't understand him. And the thing is, he's still on this project of perfecting reason, and he does not pay any attention to the unconscious and does not understand the evolutionary necessity of what Jung was talking about. But eventually people will, I hope.
Yeah. Yeah. So Anne's saying, but one can metabolize complexes into radiance or gold and wholeness. And
exactly.
And just to follow on that, Victoria is saying, so yes, then I guess the Principe assumed it was entirely metaphorical then.
No, I think she means Jung.
Oh,
yeah. No, it is. Yeah, it's well, the thing is, alchemists, including some of literally the greatest minds of the early modern and early Renaissance world, which includes the greatest, most admired scientist practically of all time, Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton spent decades working with alchemy. And my feeling is that he was one of the more successful alchemists because he actually, by doing that work, he actually accomplished some of this individuation work by doing that. See, alchemists, the reason for hundreds and hundreds of years, alchemists and some of the greatest minds of the Western world spent time with alchemy and working on these alchemical issues, and they never came even close to getting gold. But they all, the serious ones, did experience the numinous gold of the individuation process. They accessed more of this numinous energy that radiates off of the collective unconscious, off the archetypal self, because they were able to, Jung said that all the world religions are psychotherapeutic systems. And I don't know that he said this, but he might as well have said that alchemy, likewise, to the extent that it was considered a religious practice or a spiritual practice, is also a psychotherapeutic system. And the people who spent time with alchemy tended to be just a little bit more well-balanced than people who didn't. It just, it certainly was true with Sir Isaac Newton, who just, his mechanistic view of the universe is still absolutely valid. It's superseded to a degree by Einstein's relativity, but relativity does not eliminate the facts of the mechanistic view of the universe that that Newton came up with, which was way, 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 way ahead of everybody else. So anyways, that's my rant on that. So let me get back to was there another question?
Thank you. Just one last question, which should be pretty simple. Thanks, everybody. By the way, Victoria is recommending checking out Idris Shah's Oriental Magic. And there was one other question here, and it was related to the readings. And I know, I mean, everybody who has taken a class from James already knows he's a tremendous scholar and extremely well read. So you definitely, James, will be providing readings. But the question is, what about readings for further study or as background for the lectures during the 8-week course?
Well, well, one thing about the 8-week course is that we've been doing this with the other two, and we're going slowly, but we would like to construct, me and Bonnie still have to work that out in the future of the Alliance and all that, but we still would like to construct a certification program, in-depth psychology, which would include each of these courses. And eventually we would like to put them into video form and all that. But each one has an online platform, which through that is accessible. Some video, there'll be not as many videos as there were in others because there aren't as many videos about alchemical stuff. I may have some Jungian things, but a lot of texts, articles, and things like that will be accessible through the online platform. There'll be, if you want to go for a certificate, we will be offering a certificate in Jung and alchemy at the end of the course if you complete the online program, which will have a couple of quizzes, a paper, a weekly discussion, and I'm giving you this outline because the textbook for the course will be you've probably seen the Encountering Jung series that is put out by Princeton Bollingen Press. Well, there's one Jung on alchemy. The editor is Nathan Schwartz-Salent, and that will be the textbook. It's not my favorite book. I really wanted to use something like Jung's Psychology and Alchemy, but what's good about it is that it has kind of a high level introduction about Jung, which I'll help to walk people through, but it has lots and lots of a broad spectrum of Jung's own writings. It's little pieces taken out that are easily digested. If you had to read all of Psychology and Alchemy, I think it'd be a little too much, but this one on Jung, I can show you a copy of it later, but it's on Jung, Jung on alchemy in the Encountering Jung series will be the textbook. That's also good. It's not the ideal book for someone just starting out. If you're not going to take the course, you just want to read it, I probably wouldn't recommend that one. I would recommend maybe Maria. There really isn't an excellent book. Marie-Louise von Franz's little book, Alchemical Active Imagination, may be a good place to start. Eliada's book is good, but it's really history of religions. It's not covering Jung's things. So anyways, that's the best I can offer right off the bat. But there will be a variety of scanned articles and things available through the online platform for those people who register for the course.
Excellent. Thank you, James. I think you can continue.
Sure. Okay, so when we start the course next week, the first module will be on alchemy and the history of science. We'll look at alchemy from the perspective of the historian of science. Historians of science, as I've mentioned, primarily focus on the material aspects of alchemy, and they look for ways that alchemy paved the way for the modern scientific method. They deliberately strip away all the mythical elements and focus mainly on the equipment and physical apparatus of the alchemists, their operations and experimentations, and their chemical discoveries. Principe, for example, wants to show that these guys were not just crazy people. It's always been an embarrassment for scientists that alchemy even existed because it's so rife with just amazing imagery. If you look at Jung's books on alchemy, they're full of these amazing, wonderful plates of fantastic creatures and fantastic transformations and all these things going on and things in test tubes and all that. In Principe's book, there's a bunch of pictures, but it's all these very serious looking alchemists, paintings of alchemists looking like scientists. So he's trying to show that they're scientists, and that's what we get from that. But what we also get is a clear history, sort of the bare bones aspects of these things. The goal of the historian of science is to separate out the mystical and the esoteric elements of alchemy in order to focus on and discover the exoteric and material elements, and then try and pat themselves on the back for saying, yes, we rose from this to being real scientists that we are now. But by starting out with this bare bones approach, we'll be able to see some of the historical developments and practical approaches of the alchemists without the distraction of the multiple layers of symbols, because they, though essential and important, it's hard to see these elements of alchemy if we just start focusing right on the symbols. That's what I was saying about Schwartz Salient and his book. He jumps right in. Sometimes you can't tell. He says the prima. He starts talking about the prima materia, but he's not talking about what the alchemists called prima materia. He's talking about the psychological prima materia, and it becomes confusing without some sort of guide through it. So starting out with the bare bones can help us to make those distinctions a little bit easier. So module 2 is approaching from the history of religions. After attending the Eranos conference in Europe and hearing Jung speak on the religious aspects of alchemy, the historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, did his own research and wrote a book called The Forge and the Crucible, which traces the history of religious and mythological ideas that form the basis for many of the ideas found in later alchemy, and mainly from the position of metallurgy. There's some other ones we'll mention that have to do with ancient Egypt and how the Greeks also influenced Egyptian thought. But from this point of view, this is what he has to say. Mineral substances shared in the sacredness of the Earth Mother. Very early on, we are confronted with the notion that ores grow in the belly of the earth after the manner of embryos. This is the mythological understandings of this in the early. The Smiths and all these people were treated like shamans. They were very numinous because they were able to empower people with swords and wheels and all these things. So metallurgy thus takes on the characteristics of obstetrics. Miner and metalworker intervene in the unfolding of subterranean embryology. They accelerate the rhythm of the growth of ores. They collaborate in the work of nature and assist it to give birth more rapidly. And this is what the alchemists say. They say that nature is always transforming these metals, but it does it very, 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 very slowly. And what we're going to do in the alchemical workshop is speed up the natural process. That's part of their theory. So contemporary historians of religion, who are more recent than Eliade, understand alchemy in the context of what they call Western esotericism. This approach has brought much new information and scholarship on the topic, but sadly, as I already mentioned, like historians of science, historians of religion dismiss Jung before even attempting to really understand what he's doing, and they lump him in with the group I was talking about earlier of people who practice alchemy as a religious practice, and they think that that's what Jung's doing, which is just nonsense, because clearly they haven't read Jung at all if they think that. So then module 3, we're going to look at Jung's own work, his body of work in alchemy. He spent approximately 25 years of his life on his research and study in the field of alchemy. So in this module, we're going to survey his major publications on alchemy and why he chose to proceed in the way that he did. So these works include The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is the first one that he encountered, Psychology and Alchemy, which is surprisingly, if it really, the part 3 of Psychology and Alchemy, I really recommend to anybody. I really, as I said, I wanted to include it in the, as the textbook, but it may be a little, the whole book is a little overwieldy for that, but the part 3, I think it's called The Religious Problem of Alchemy, something like that, is very understandable. He outlines alchemy pretty clearly, and a lot of the mythological elements he outlines very clearly, and he outlines his understanding of the psychological significance of it. So I highly recommend that, but we'll talk about that. The psychology of the transference, in which he goes through a series of pictures from the Rosarium Philosophorum and extracts from that his ideas about the transference which is projection, which happens within the sealed container of the analytical situation with analyst and analysand, and how the projections and counter projections go back and forth. Then he's got a book, a collection of alchemical studies, which is actually Secret of the Golden Flower is in that. Then there's Ion, which is kind of an introduction to his great magnum opus, the final work, which is very difficult to read, Mysterium Conjunctionis. So going through and summarizing each of these works will help us to understand how Jung applied alchemy to his psychotherapeutic work, and it will help anyone interested in going deeper into Jung's work with alchemy to kind of know where to head. The historical alchemical paradigm is what we're going to cover in module 4. And this is this whole sort of broad, I want to put it all in the broad spectrum that I mentioned before. We'll combine all that we've learned up to this point in order to understand the cultural context of the rise of alchemy and the significance of alchemical symbolism for the cultures in which it arose, but also for contemporary culture. Drawing on Marie-Louise von Franz's essay, Psyche and Matter in Alchemy and Modern Science, we'll explore the movement of psyche from identification to projection, from that to repression, then to reemergence in the contemporary world, both consciously and unconsciously, and commercialization, pharmacology, and many other things. As von Franz says, this, and she's talking about the survey in her essay, this historical survey has shown us that in late antiquity, the psyche was located outside of the individual in the animated matter of the universe. It consisted in a multiplicity of colliding components, or of gods, star divinities, and demons, or of powers in the organs of the body, or in chemical substances. Jung has shown that what we now call the collective unconscious has never been something psychological, or something that was understood psychologically. It has always been relegated to the outside cosmos, to the extra psychic cosmic sphere. And this is what I was saying about projection, and about Jung saying that religious systems are psychotherapeutic systems. All of the psyche was experienced through these external vehicles and were accessed, and psyche, the grandiosity, and all these energies that radiate off of the archetypal self were regulated through these religious systems. So, although for those of us interested in depth psychology, the psyche is the collective unconscious, for many today, the psyche is still experienced as outside of us and in what she calls the extra psychic cosmic sphere. And we're going to start to look at some of the ways in which that's true, and that will hopefully prepare us for going into the use of alchemy in relation to individuation and dreams and all that, which we start with module 5. And that's just cover the basics of the symbolism of alchemy. We'll dig into some of the nuts and bolts of alchemical symbolism, including aspects of the process such as synchronicity, which is astrology, which is a big element of the timing of when the work is done, and also the metals each have an astrological correlate, and there's lots of complex multi-layers of mythologies and all these things. Plus the alchemist's own attitude towards the work is a part of it, the process of the work, etc. Now, some of these basic concepts of alchemy that we'll explore include 3 basic aspects of the alchemical process, which is the opus itself, the work, which corresponds to, for example, the hero's journey, or entering into analysis, or entering into a commitment to do some sort of work. I'm talking now on the metaphorical level for people doing work. The prima materia and the operations. The prima materia being, we want to get down to the core complexes and the core. The prima materia for Jung is the collective unconscious, and he says the cultural prima materia is the Sybil and Addis myth, and we'll talk about that. That's Schwartz-Salent talks about that a lot. It's not time to touch on that now, but what he understood, what the alchemists understood prima materia to be, and what Jung understood culturally and individually, what people ended up working on as the prime matter that was going to be transformed. That's part of that. And then also there's the operations themselves, because it's a process. It's not just a static set of terms. The processes include calcinatio, solutio, coagulatio, and sublimatio. And if you notice these, again, we talked about the Aristotelian elements and all that. Calcinatio is fire, solutio is water, coagulatio is earth, and sublimatio is air. So you have earth, air, fire, and water. Separatio and conjunctio are these things of separating things out, making distinctions. Remember, there's a parallel here with the discriminating mind, which has to make distinctions and separate things out. So that's separatio. And then conjunctio is when you bring them all together in a way that is dynamic and new and creates this new thing. Previously you had lead, separate everything out, move it around in a particular way, and then you have gold. Well, That's never happened for alchemists, but they kept doing it because they were getting some kind of gold subjectively. And Jung is saying that this same individuation process also creates gold for us in the term, in the way of giving us energy that we can access to use in our life and work and communities. So we'll look at both the chemical background and the psychological significance of these processes, as well as what their practical use might be in pursuing the goal of the alchemists, which is the philosopher's stone, as well as the goal of the Jungian, which is individuation. Module 6, we're going to look at how all these things can work in terms of dream interpretation. We'll look at how alchemical symbolism can be understood in relation to dream interpretation, and understanding the dream interpretation process as a dialogue with the unconscious. Part 2 of Jung's book, Psychology and Alchemy, is called Individual Dream Symbolism in Relation to Alchemy. In this study, Jung goes step by step through a dream series of a scientist, who we find out later it was Nobel Prize winner Wolfgang Pauli, who also worked with Jung on his synchronicity project. Jung shows the parallels between these dreams and the images that appear in alchemy. So we're going to touch on that. We're going to work on pull out some high points from that to see exactly what he's talking about and how dream work works in terms of alchemical symbolism. And part of this, an important element of this approach, is the processual nature of a dream series. He goes through many, and there, I think he said some like 400 dreams. He doesn't go through all of them. He pulled out the rich ones, but you can see right off the bat that Jung is interested in the process and the developmental phases that dreams go through, not so much each dream being pulled apart and getting obsessed with each dream. And that some dreams can be particularly powerful and pivotal, but he also spent a lot of time on the developmental and processual nature of the dream series, which is parallel to the alchemical work, which is a process, a dynamic process. Neither of these processes are static images or stationary events. Each represents a process that one must go through in order to reach the end goal. In the alchemical work, the end goal is to produce actual gold. In the dream work, the goal is to produce the gold of individuation and this life energy that we can bring to bear on our own individual projects and families and communities. So, Module 7, we're going to expand on that and look specifically at alchemical symbolism and individuation. As we just saw in alchemical dream symbolism, one important element of alchemy as a system of symbols, that it represents a process of change and a transformation. And Jung saw specific parallels between the imaginative transformations envisioned by the alchemists and what he describes as the process of individuation. And key to this, a central part of this is this, the second part of the processes that I mentioned, which is the separatio and the conjunctio. And the key to the whole opus is the final conjunctio. Usually there's many repetitions which lead to, I forget the technical name, but minor conjunctios. Then there's the big final conjunctio. And that's a key part of the symbolism of individuation, which we will be looking at. Now, Jung says the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. And that's what I was saying earlier about this standing midway between the culture and the pressures of the culture on the one hand, and the pressures of the inner objects on the other hand, and being able to divest oneself of the false wrappings of each, the suggestive power of one and the false wrappings of the other. So there are essentially two stages of the individuation process. The first stage is the task of the first half of life and involves the natural development of personality, social adaptation, and developing a strong ego. The second stage involves integrating the shadow and learning to regulate the energies of the collective unconscious. In this module, we're going to look at how alchemical symbols correspond to this process, and both, as I said, both elements of it. The emerging separating of the ego from the self, as we saw in those Edinger diagrams, and then once that's established and a strong enough ego, is established, then we can begin the work of reconnecting and integrating the shadow and integrating a relationship, at least, with the powers of the collective unconscious. And then the final module will be on the modern cultural significance of alchemy. It will review everything we've learned to this point, building our discussion that we started in Module 4. We'll look at different ways to understand the many layers of meaning that emerged from alchemical symbolism when looked at in the context of the contemporary world. Jung's understanding of the unconscious as expressed through the imagery and texts of the alchemists has far-reaching implications for modern people, from personal inner work to environmentalism, to modern pharmacology, to feminism, to consumerism, and all kinds of materialism and political power and many, many other things. So although Jung read alchemy as if it was the dream of Christian culture, we can also see today that alchemy is the shadow of modern science, because there's still places in our culture where modern science is really stuck in the alchemical vision. And I'll expand on that more. So these ancient alchemical texts provide us with a wealth of symbolic insight into the human mind and human behaviors that continue to be vitally relevant today. And that's what we got, and I hope that sounds intriguing. There's so much there, and I'll tell you, with 8 weeks, we will not even begin to cover everything in alchemy, but I hope it would introduce you to enough to take away some of the obscurity and some of the mystery of it, and show you where and how it helps not only in our individuation processes, but how it helps us to adapt to the collective and understand the collective a little better.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you so much, James. And I know some people are echoing this. There are a couple of questions here, which I'm going to go to in just a moment. Richard's asking to pass along how much he loves your slides, which you definitely have. You always do such a great job with that. It's really easy to follow. So thank you. So a couple of questions, and I will just say, actually, before you jump into that when when I was first introduced to alchemy, for me, what really resonated was the capacity to look at this from a nature or elemental standpoint, and to really realize how much ritual can stem from the process of alchemy, as we begin to look at things like earth, water, air, and fire, and how those are at work in our lives. And I'm particularly thinking now about the wildfires in California and how that fire is working individually.
Yeah, and on the other side of the world, I was stuck in floods in Bombay because 1,200 people died in floods in South Asia this summer. A lot of people here didn't hear anything about that, but so there's like tons and tons of water suddenly appearing over here, and no water in the northwest, and terrible fires resulting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure we'll get to some of that during the series. Meanwhile, a couple of questions. First of all, I'm going to go to the more theoretical question, and then there's a question, James, about the series and how much, well, maybe we should do that first. Let's do that. So the question is, will the series also have opportunities for participants to chat with each other about the course materials and related ideas? So I know several people on this particular event have taken your series. They understand that. So maybe we can address that briefly, though, for those who don't know.
Yeah, well, first of all, there is, and there's been a couple people who have been really kind of proactive about getting people together and getting groups outside of anything that I organize. But on the online platform, if you decide to work with the online platform, there's required, if you want to go for the certificate, discussions every week. And people developed, I know, long-standing relationships. I know 3 women at least were meeting and having groups because they lived in the same area or relatively close, just as a result of the friendships that they made through the discussion group. So yeah, it's not only is there an opportunity, but it's, if you decide to go for the certificate, it's a requirement. Excellent.
Thank you. If anybody else has questions, please feel free. Let's see, Richard said he's actually in Santa Rosa right now, and so he's kind of in the midst of all of this activity. Jeez. I know, that's what I was just thinking too. So I hope you're staying safe over there, Richard.
Yeah, and I've got many friends in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they're saying that people miles and miles and miles and miles away, people in Oakland and in Walnut Creek, and they're saying that the air quality is worse than they've ever seen any air quality. Yeah. Just because there's so much smoke and so much stuff. I can only imagine where it is, how bad it is in Santa Rosa and places close to the fires. It's just,
Yeah.
it's just.
So you also have that, the element of air, which is being affected.
Yeah,
there, so.
yeah,
Okay,
exactly. Yeah.
questions and comments are coming in thick and fast. So I know we still have some time, but let's see how many of these we can get to as we go. So let me go back to the initial question I was going to ask, and that is from Craig. How are the false wrappings of persona different from ego?
Well, persona is a particular aspect of the ego, which Jung calls the persona a functional complex. So it's a specific complex that is sort of a part of the ego complex, which interacts with the social world. So we put up the persona is actually one of the elements that that creates the shadow, because as we build a persona, we're picking and choosing what things we present to the world, and those things that we don't present, we tend to repress, and those are the things that go into the shadow. So the persona is the mechanism, the functional complex of the ego. It's like an appendage of the ego that the ego uses for social interaction. Does that clarify that?
Yeah, let us know if it doesn't, Craig.
Yeah.
Let's see. So he says yes. Okay, great. So let's move on to this question. So this question is coming from Chris, and he's asking, in the dream module, will you be mentioning Edinger's alchemical operations work in dream symbolism?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Great. And
yeah,
then
and I highly that's another book that it's not his book, Anatomy of the Psyche. I'm going to have it right here. Anatomy of the Psyche is a wonderful little book. One of the more practical books that I found on alchemy, which just shows clearly how you tie in the alchemical operations with practical work, dream work, and practical understandings of. I mean, pretty much any time water is prominent in a dream, then it's a solutio factor. And if you know anything about astrology, this whole earth, air, water, and fire thing relates to all kinds of astrological symbolism. And yeah, so in any case, yeah, I love that book, and we'll definitely draw on Edinger's understanding of those processes.
Great, thank you. And then part two of his question is kind of along those same lines. Have you ever looked into Adam McLean's Hermetic source work, and will we be referring to that at all?
I've not even heard of it, no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Chris, maybe you can teach James something, and all of us.
That's right.
I have not either. Thank you. Okay, let's see, moving along. Charmel, I'm not clear, sorry, and I just sent the wrong text. I'm doing too many things at once. I just sent the wrong text to the wrong person. But Charmel, you said that you ordered the book, but Amazon has said that it's out of stock. Which book is that? Can you just clarify? I'm assuming you're meaning the Edinger one that...
Yeah, no, he's talking about the Alchemy book, I think.
Yeah,
on
the
Jung on Alchemy. Yeah, well, I know it's available through like Bookfinder. Have you tried Bookfinder?
No.
Yeah, I would try that.
You might have to, I'm sorry to hear that it's not available in Amazon, and maybe they'll get more in.
Well, I wondered if it would be too late for the class. I think they had other ones, but where I ordered it, they canceled the order. So
Okay.
if I order something now, then I only have a week to get it for the class. So I was wondering if the book is downloadable, or how will that?
I'm pretty sure it's not downloadable. Although I think I will have. Trying to remember, I may have a scan of the introduction, but not of all the Jung.
If you promise and swear you've ordered it, so we don't run into any copyright issues. Yeah, that may be possible. Reach out to us, Charmel, separately to James or to me, and we can look at that. See what we can do.
Thank you.
Another question, which I think I can answer, Brian, you're asking about the opportunity to audit the course. I know a lot of people out there don't feel like they have time to do all the assignments and to do it formally for the certificate of completion. But if you would like to audit the course, you're absolutely welcome to do that. It's a good way to do it. You have access to all the recordings of the lectures after the fact, so you can always go back and do those on your own time, or else do them again and again so that you're sure to understand. And so if that's the case, feel free to do that. The registration process is exactly the same. It's just that if you're not going to be doing the assignments and that kind of thing, then you just won't do it. And as long as James knows that, he won't expect that. Do you want to add to that, James?
No, that usually I was a little distracted because I noticed that. Now, did you take over the meeting and have the recording going? Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, well, I freaked out because I saw that he asked that, and I thought, well, I better make sure it's still recording.
Yes.
Yeah, no, but normally, provided technology works and everything is the way it's supposed to be, we post the PowerPoint in the form of PDF, we post the audio, and we post the video, and throughout the course, and usually for some time afterwards, you have access to that, so you can follow up on it. And there's no requirement whatsoever to do any of that, only if you want. I don't feel comfortable giving certificates to people unless they've kind of really engaged the material. So that's the only reason we have this sort of request that you take the quizzes and you do the papers and all that. But if you don't care about getting a certificate, you're very, very welcome to take part without doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can also, if you want to, pardon me, if you want to, for example, take part in the discussions, but you don't want to take the quizzes, or you don't want to do the exam or anything like that, that's fine too. So you can still have the interaction with your classmates. You can still download things if you want them, or access whatever is on the online platform, but without having to do any of that stuff. So you have complete freedom to do however, as much or as little as you want.
Yeah, which has worked really well in the past. James has really got this down to a system, which is great. So, and by the way, I'm seeing several people are saying in the group chat that they have managed to find the book on Amazon and other places. So be sure and tune into that if you do feel like you're having trouble finding it. There are some specific links there to it too. So now everybody will be fighting for those same books on Amazon, but get it while you can, I guess.
But check Bookfinder too, because Abe Books will usually have it, and there'll be there's like Textbooks R Us and things like that where you can find it. But I always go to Bookfinder first, and that tracks things down usually pretty well.
Thank you, everybody, for participating and giving those options if you have them. Yeah. Are there other questions that anybody would like to ask about the theory, about alchemy itself, about some of the processes? I mean, obviously, all of these things we'll go into more, but if there's more you'd like to know today, we have just a few more minutes, and James is here, so you might as well take advantage of that. If you'd like to type it in, feel free, or you can also just unmute yourself and speak it if you'd like at any point in time. I think everybody's online ordering the book.
Well, that's good. Well, yeah, so I think the main thing, as I said, is my goal is to, well, number one, to make it less impenetrable, and because I think it's so useful. And although someone was asking, am I going to be, I'm not going to be teaching, specific psychotherapeutic techniques or anything like that, but my hope is that, and my intuition is that the way I'm presenting it is that these things will emerge, and it'll become, as we go through, it'll become more and more obvious, the application and the sense of why these things are valuable. And one of the reasons these things are valuable is because we are so consciously, and our mindsets now have so absorbed this project of the perfection of reason, and technology and science and everything is everywhere, that these same patterns that came up in the unconscious of the alchemists are coming up in modern people. Modern people think more and more now like Wolfgang Pauli did, and as a result, there are all these parallels in our dreams and in our lives that reflect these alchemical patterns. So it's almost a misnomer to even call it alchemical, because it's the name itself constellates sort of very mysterious things, but it's not. Once you learn the patterns, like I said, earth, air, fire, and water, separatio, conjunctio, it's not that complicated in terms of trying to integrate the discriminating mind with what's coming up from the unconscious. What becomes overwhelming for us is, particularly if you're like me or a trauma survivor, or you've got really painful things in the past, is that there's complexes and things. They're the things that come up that kind of throw you out of whack. And that's why it's good if you're going to be, first of all, again, there's two systems or two phases of individuation. One is building a strong ego. And for a lot of us, that's the first thing we need to do, just kind of batten down the hatches and make sure that before you start digging around in the unconscious, you've got a boat that can withstand the weight of the fish that you're going to be pulling up, the complexes and the energies that are going to be coming up. The second phase is this business of fishing and trying to make sense out of what comes up out of the unconscious. And there's the level of the personal complex and peeling the onion of the personal complex and trying to figure out what in my personal history is tied in with these things. But at the core is of the complex is these archetypal, typically human patterns that carry with them this symbolic energy that when we have access to it, can really help to vitalize our lives. Jung is somebody who was doing this all the time, and you look at his body of work, he's got this gigantic 20-volume encyclopedic collected works, and he was doing this right up till whatever he was, 84 or so, just constantly active and full of energy. And I attribute it to his his inner work that he was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. You mentioned a minute ago parallel, and I didn't catch that, but Tanya's asking for an example of a parallel in the terms of how you used it. Do you remember what you said?
So, I'm sorry. You were? I thought you were talking to someone else.
Yeah, no, I'm talking to you. You mentioned the word parallel a minute ago in something that you said, and we're looking for an example of a parallel in terms of how you used it. I missed it when I was doing something else.
Gee, I don't remember even saying the parallel.
Tanya, can you clarify that? Sorry about that. She's saying a parallel in dreams.
Parallel in dreams. Well, yeah. Okay. So, well, like I said, there's, I often have dreams where suddenly the water just comes pouring in from everywhere. There's water seeping in. There's a couple inches of water on the, and I know that there's two things that happen. One is I'm either indulging my emotions too much, or I'm blocking my emotions. And there's some, the water, the solutio, tends to be something that that dissolves things, but it makes everything mushy. And so if I'm being too repressive and too sort of working too hard and doing too many things, the water will start rising, and I realize I've got to kind of do something that helps me to access and release emotions. And another way they sometimes appear is that if I'm being too self-indulgent and too moody, too anima possessed, water also will be appearing in my dreams. So it depends on this. Yeah, the dreams are always contextual as to what's going on in your life at the time. But so that's one thing. Fire is another thing that come up. I've had dreams where something was on fire, and for me, there was some buried rage that I was not addressing. Does that help with that?
Yeah, that helps. I'm thinking I had a dream a few days ago about having water leak into a place where there was lots of electricity and the electrical cord. So there's definitely that issue. Somebody else is saying she just dreamt yesterday she was in a small house that collapsed in a sudden flood. And Tanya's been saying she's been finding fires in her dreams. So I think once we start looking at this, it's like that week is going to be really exciting in the course, because I'm sure we're going to have tons of examples of.
Yeah. Another thing, it doesn't necessarily have, and for me, it tends to be emotion. It doesn't have to be that. It can also just be being flooded by the unconscious. The right. Boat is too small at this time. It depends. Like I said, it's contextual and situational, and that's why a lot of people recommend dream groups rather than being trying to figure out your dreams by yourself. Having, if not a therapist, just an objective voice to say, well, obvious, it's
somebody to mirror things back to you. Yeah, it's really hard to do your own dream work, I find, at least for me. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. Great questions. A last question here. It doesn't have to be the last question, but the last one I think I see here was, a question about, is this, I don't recall, but is this 8-week course part of a larger program? I just wanted to address that because I've had a couple of comments on that so far. Those of you who have been following James, particularly in his series, are aware that we have been talking for a long time about doing a certificate program that would be a certificate in depth psychology, sponsored by Depth Psychology Alliance. It's a huge undertaking, you guys. We're doing what we can, but it's really hard. We don't have a lot of resources. I mean, it's really basically James teaching the courses and me running the Alliance. We don't have a lot of resources that have been dedicated, or planning that has been dedicated to that, beyond our desire to do it and a look at what classes those would be. It's the putting in place is just taking a little bit longer than we were hoping. So technically it would potentially be part of a bigger certificate. We just don't have a timeline on that quite yet.
What I'm doing is, I love doing this. I teach, as I said, mainstream stuff, and the mainstream academics are not interested in Jung any more than scientists or historians. I'm actually, my degree is in history of religions, and nobody, I was actually told I would not be admitted into my doctoral program if I wanted to do Jung. I literally told that. So I said, never heard of Jung, because I wanted to get the degree. But so the point is that I love doing it, so I'm going to keep doing it as long as people continue to be interested. I'm kind of stockpiling these, I'm putting the lectures together and putting it all together, and it'll be relatively easy once we've got a body of classes, and now I've got 3, hopefully we'll get more. And as we do that, then I can turn them into videos. The idea is that we could have, instead of me doing weekly classes, we'll have video classes so people can do them at their own pace, and then have weekly like coaching sessions where you can ask questions and talk, and as we're doing here, and talk about the material and do your prep work for whatever the assignments are for that thing. And then as you complete a certificate for each class, that whatever the number of classes needed for the certificate in depth psychology, and we're thinking also like a graduate level after that, which would be more applied things and more specific people, probably people aside from Bonnie and I know Doreen, who is a board member, is doing all these things on typology, and that could be an element of a graduate level course, things like that.
Yeah.
But at the moment, we're trying to put it together at a pace we can do it. We both have to work at other things in order to stay viable.
Yeah, thank you for that, James. And so, yeah, I mean, there might be an opportunity for us to grow that directly if we have more resources. I know Gail and some others were offering to see if there was something that could be done. So there are more to come on that. But as James said, for now, if you are interested in that overall certificate in in-depth psychology, at least be aware and be doing as much as you can to take the courses that are being offered right now that will count toward that, because ultimately our hope is that you'll have enough by the time we get to that point that you'll already kind of almost be qualified. So. Yeah.
Now, I saw there's
question on shamanism?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. It says, I'm thinking that alchemy came from a particular time in European history. Could we say that shamanism has a similar phases of initiation and comes from an earlier, less differentiated into rational and non-rational? Yes, absolutely. It's a very good way to put it. Yeah, it's a different, the shaman is keeping his tribe. He's, basically the therapist for his tribe, and his job is to keep his tribe well balanced. And shamans were very precise. They were almost a kind of scientist, because they would very precisely know the movement of the stars, and they had to know when the different celestial events happened, when to do the calendrical rituals and all that kind of stuff. So they were a particular kind of scientist and had a particular kind of way of speaking to the deep unconscious of the people in their community and getting them to respond. And yeah, it's very different, but very similar. If you look at one of my favorite Jungians is Robert Moore, and he's got his whole theory of king, warrior, magician, lover, and both the alchemist and the shaman fall along the gradient of the magician. It's a very similar manifestation of this sort of archetypal pattern.
Excellent. Does anybody else have questions for James? We're pretty much at the hour, so we want to make sure that we're respecting the time frame we gave you guys. Looks like we're kind of out of those kind of questions. So James is very accessible, has been. So if you are signing up for the 8-week course, please know that you will absolutely have a lot of his attention. He makes time during every session to do this kind of Q&A where everybody has a chance to check in. And we're generally accessible. Otherwise, we're both, as James said, very busy, and it's impossible to answer every one of the thousands of members of Depth Psychology Alliance, but we do what we can when we can. So that's
well, luckily there weren't 1,000 on the call today. So
yeah. Yeah, we did have a very high number of registrants, so we really appreciate everybody who's been here and your interest in the topic, which I think is just personally, I think it's so fascinating, and hope that you will take advantage of that early bird registration and join us for the next several weeks. Thank you all so much.